Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode Around the Fire on Spirit Reflections. My name is Fred Govea here from Manhattan, coming to you live on the channel and interviewing a dear friend across the Hudson River, Peter Hayes in New Jersey. Peter, good evening and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And for those that are joining us for the first time, we invite you to log on to Spirit Reflections on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, get the notifications so that you will be on top of all our conversations around the fire. And for those that are joining us for the first time, heartfelt welcome. This is a space for you to interact with us, to ask your questions, your testimonials, your comments, and this be a space that we can all huddle around the quintessential fire of comfort, of inspiration, and leave the conversations feeling more warm inside than when we left. And Spirit Reflection started during the pandemic as a channel to interview people about their personal and spiritual journeys, the tools that they found along the way, and how they used those tools to mold who they are and the work that they do today. We've interviewed guests from all walks of life, artists, religious people, spiritualists. We've interviewed scientists and people with very diverse life experiences with the intent to share what we know and what inspires us, and let this be a conversation around the fire. As you can see, we come from a very long line of reincarnations, and as far back as our ancestors millennia ago, when we used to be hunter-gatherers in small tribes and communities, we would, at the end of the day, sit down somewhere in nature in our time of rest and light up a fire. And around that fire, we would find protection from the elements. We would find friendship. We would sing, we would laugh, we would cry, we would entrust our little ones to the elder ones of the tribe, and we would look up into the sky and wonder, what's all this about? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Why are we here? And today, because of Zoom and all this technology, we can huddle around the fire from anywhere on the planet. And who knows, maybe other dimensions if this gets somehow broadcast through these wormholes in outer space. Mark, welcome. Good evening. Thanks for being here with us all the way from California. So I will put our opening vignette and we'll introduce you to Peter formally. And this is a little piece by Debussy called Rêverie, meaning dreams. So it gets us into that right state. So I will read Peter's official bio for those that have never met him. And it goes like this. So Peter is the president of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey, where he has been an active member for nearly 20 years. He has done lectures in English about Spiritism within the United States and has participated in several U.S. Spiritist Symposiums. Besides doing over 60 episodes of the radio program Living Spring on Kardec Radio, he was on the editing staff of the Spirits book, which was published by the United States Spiritist Federation, and he did work on Love and Light's publications in English. Peter loves to play the guitar, and we've played many times together. He teaches kids and adults at Love and Light, and we'll show you a few videos about that later. And this has led him to do regular visits to a New Jersey nursing home to perform music. And occasionally he crosses over to the Hudson River here to meet our friends in New York City, part of our Caravan of Love effort to go to nursing homes, hospitals. And he has also a background in theater as a playwright, a literary manager, an electrician, and a carpenter. He's a man of many trades. And he has published several children's books with his wife, Brazilian author and amazing artist, this artist soul that she is, Beti Rozencwajg. Sorry, Betty. Through their company, Sem Fronteiras Press, with publishers in Brazil and Colombia. And we will interview Betty next year because she's also an amazingly talented woman and very entertaining to interview. So, Peter, now that we've officially introduced you with all of the pomp and circumstance, welcome and tell us a little bit about your personal and spiritual journey that got to where you are today.
Well, let's see. How did I get involved in Spiritism? Actually, the way to explore that, I'd have to tell you all how I met my wife, Beti Rozencwajg. It's a Polish last name, by the way. Similar to Sisters Rosenzweig, which was a play by Wendy Wasserstein, but spelled differently. But anyway, so I met Betty in New York, and it was, I would, at the time, seemed like it was by chance. Of course, Spiritism teaches us that nothing is by chance. And I won't tell you everything just yet about how we met, but I'll say this. I had a reference book on the theater in my hand. So why was I in New York with a book on theater? This was back in 1993. And by that point, I had been back east for a while, but I actually wasn't born in New York or on the East Coast at all. I was born in California in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Which some say is the better coast, and we have a lot of Californians watching, so
Right.
Everybody, here is one of your own.
Aha, okay, very good. So I mention this because at the age of 16, I wound up moving from California. How did that happen? Again, a series of events that led to that, which occurred when I was very young. Unfortunately, my mother and father got a divorce by the time I was 5. My mother was a very talented musician. She used to play classical piano. She was studying pretty seriously at one point and trying to be a concert pianist, but she, in retrospect, had started too late and didn't have, had developed some bad habits. But I used to hear Chopin's waltzes as a kid, her running through certain moments of some of the waltzes over and over again. So thanks to her, I got interested in classical music. And my mother, after my mother and my father separated, I was 4 at the time. My mother was a fairly unhappy housewife, I would say, and she decided it was time to make a life change. And so my mother got accepted into UC Berkeley, one of the best universities in the world. UC Berkeley is a school that my grandfather, William C. Hayes, helped to build because he was a professor of architecture. He moved from Philadelphia to California in 1904, so a couple of years before the earthquake in San Francisco. And he collaborated with a guy named John Galen Howard, who built much of UC Berkeley. The Bancroft Library is something that my grandfather worked on. There are pictures of my grandfather in front of the campanile, the very famous symbol of UC Berkeley. So, and he was there for many, many years. And I'm fortunate to have a book that has extensive information because he was interviewed a couple of years before he passed away. So my mother went to UC Berkeley. My grandfather was connected there. So was my aunt, Dale, who graduated from there. And my mother basically, at the age of roughly 34, made a complete life change. She had married when she was about 20. Neither she nor my father, I think, in retrospect, were ready to really commit to family life in the way that they had to for a while. And my mother then went to UC Berkeley, got a PhD in English. And by the time I was 15 or so, she was looking to find work as a professor of English. So she made a huge life change. And by that point, I was already interested in theater. Okay, I'm going to digress slightly by mentioning that I went to grammar school, and then around the time I was in the 4th grade, I went to an experimental school for 1 year, which was in Berkeley. And I mention this because there was a life-changing event that happened there. Again, could have been random, if you will, but there are no accidents, as Spiritism likes to say. What happened was that a guy showed up one day with a movie camera, and we got to make a movie. And so we just made a movie. There I was at the age of 10. He had a 16 millimeter Bolex camera, if I remember correctly. And we made one movie with him, and then he came back a couple of weeks later because we had so much fun. We did another one. And that got me interested in filmmaking. And at the age of 12, I got a Super 8 movie camera for a Christmas present, and I made a whole bunch of movies. So while I was still living in Berkeley, I thought, I'm interested in movies. That was kind of the direction I was going in. But then a friend of mine who I made a movie with at the age of 15 or so asked me if I would work on a play with him at Berkeley High School. Berkeley High School had an exceptional theater program for a typical high school. This was a high school that did Bertolt Brecht plays. Bertolt Brecht was a German playwright, very much a communist. Because,
not a typical high school drama department.
No, Berkeley is one of the most progressive, communities in the country. And so the free speech movement and all that was happening in my backyard, which I could go into later if you want. But anyway, so my friend at the time asked me if I'd work on a play with him, and I had to do these projections. It happened to be a Bertolt Brecht play. So that was my introduction to theater. And that got me interested in theater, got interested in stage lighting and so forth. And just before I left California, I was starting to work at UC Berkeley as a volunteer for their theater. So it was a college level theater called Zellerbach. And I was already very involved with theater. So why am I mentioning this? Because again, it so happens that my mother got a PhD in English, was ready to teach, and I had been introduced to theater by the time I was 16 and was interested in it. But I also was interested in filmmaking, and I thought I wanted to be a cinematographer. Well, at the age of 16, major life event change happened for me, which was we moved out of California to upstate New York. And at that time, for me, the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area was the center of the universe. It's something that my brother and I would often joke about. To me, that was all there was practically.
That 9 square miles.
Yes. I mean, I'd been to Lake Tahoe. If people in California certainly are familiar with Lake Tahoe, it's a wonderful place to visit. Place my father had been going to since he was a kid in the 20s and 30s. But anyway, I hadn't traveled that much. So going to New York, upstate New York, which was a small conservative town, but a beautiful one called Saratoga Springs. And we went there because my mother got hired as a professor at Skidmore College. So I was literally a fish out of water. I was in this small town and had to adapt. And there was nothing in the way of film. But there was some things going on in the way of theater. So I was able to volunteer at the theater department at Skidmore, even though I was still in high school. And to make a long story short, that kind of moved me further into the world of theater. And I did that for a while. I worked professionally by the time I was in college. I was beginning to realize that I didn't want to be an electrician or a carpenter for the rest of my life, because I started discovering writing in college. At least I got more introduced to it. It was something I had struggled with, to be honest, but at the same time, the spontaneity of it, the creativity of it really excited me. And I'm not a medium, I don't think, but to the extent I have any mediumship, it's through the act of writing. And when I write, sometimes things just...
That's when you think your ideas flow the most.
Yeah, exactly. So I felt that connection. And I really enjoyed the spontaneity. I loved sitting down in front of a computer or a typewriter at the time and just free flowing and just going for it and not stopping. It's an exercise where you try to write and you don't edit, you just go for it. And
like free association writing,
free
right?
association, don't judge it, don't worry about what it is or what it isn't. And then eventually something starts to happen. And then you get into a zone and then you're off and running. And it's about trying to be honest as you're involved in a creative act. And so this really interested me a lot, and I became very excited by the spontaneity of that. So by the time I was about halfway through college, I'd worked professionally, worked for the Lake George Opera Company, and I worked for the Santa Fe Opera Company, among many other places. And the Santa Fe Opera Company is a very prestigious opera company in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where my cousins are from and where my aunt and uncle lived. So I knew New Mexico to some extent. And what happened was that was kind of the summer where I was getting more interested in writing and beginning to see that the world of being an electrician and a carpenter, while I liked it and I learned a lot and I kept doing it for a while longer, but I was also beginning to think I'm not going to be doing this for the rest of my life. And it didn't help that actually a fellow technician who was in the carpentry department was killed in that season. It was
during the opera productions, or
I won't go into a lot of details, but we were doing. It was our 25th anniversary, so we were doing. They reprised La Boheme and The Rake's Progress, and let's see what else. An opera called News of the Day by Paul Hindemith, and Barbara Seville, Puccini.
yeah,
And there was this elaborate set for Daphne, I think it was, by Strauss.
all in one night.
No, we rotated.
Oh,
We rotated.
I see.
It was a grueling summer, by the way. It was like 80-plus-hour work weeks, and they rarely did the same opera 2 nights in a row. So we had to constantly change the sets or refocus the light. So I was in the electrics crew, even though I learned how to weld that summer, which was cool. By the way, my grandma, my Hayes, who was a pretty amazing sculptor, also learned how to weld. But that's
and I believe you have a few sculptures behind you in this studio there, right?
I might, if you really want me to, I might be able to grab one of them later. But anyway, that work was so grueling, and I again began to see that I didn't want to do this forever. And I was getting that feeling after I'd worked a year before at the Lake George Opera. So I was now becoming a junior in college, and I was getting more and more interested in writing. And to make a long story short, that was the direction I went in. I kept working as an electrician and carpenter for a few years after that, did it professionally after I got out of school. But I did it for a couple of years out of school. Then I was fortunate enough that I was able to spend more time focusing on playwriting. And at that point, I really wanted to get into college somewhere for a graduate program. So to make a long story short, I got accepted into NYU in New York City. I was involved in a very serious relationship at the time. So the person I was involved with, we were living in Albany, but I was back and forth between NYU and Albany, New York City and Albany. Again, I won't go into details about this, but we almost got married. but didn't work out. And again, the reasons that happened, I found significant.
Sure.
It could have easily gone the other way. We could have gotten married, but then she met somebody else temporarily, and that ended that. And neither one of us were ready,
Gotcha.
And also, realized I made some mistakes in that relationship. So why am I mentioning this? Because I was about 29 at the time. We had been together for a while. So the numbering doesn't work out quite right, but at the age of 16, I went from California to upstate New York. By the time I was 29, I made another major life change because I was graduating from NYU and my engagement was ending. So I felt horrible. And I was trying to figure out what to do. And I remember telling my mother what was happening, that the engagement was ending at this point. And my mother said, stay in New York. Why would you go back there? And I thought,
you're in the best place to be single in the world.
Yeah. So I was 29, footloose and fancy free. And I wound up staying in Manhattan. And so how did I meet my wife? Well, how did that lead me to Spiritism? What happened was I spent roughly 4 years working at that point as a literary manager. So I was interested in playwriting. I learned in the 2 years that I was at NYU a lot about the structure of, not just the structure, but the craft of playwriting. Playwright, by the way, that word is significant because it's spelled Playwright. Right means craft. So in days of old, there were shipwrights, cartwrights. Did you ever see the TV series Bonanza?
No.
Do you know about it? Okay, it was a show from my childhood, a Western. And the family were called the Cartwrights. Why? Because they built carts, wheels, carts, and so forth.
So the right to play.
Yes, the right to play, but not RIGHT as in I'm given the right, but rather I have the craft. So playwright is a crafter of plays because it requires having skill to know how to put together a story. When people learn how to write for the theater, for film, and so forth, they learn the art of storytelling, and there is a craft to it.
Sure.
You know how to construct it and so forth. Yes, there's a lot of spontaneity as far as how you develop it and all that, but at some point you got to know something about how to make a decent story, or what you hope is a decent story. By the way, that always interested me because every new play or every new project was like ground zero. It may seem wonderful, but it could fall apart later on as you keep working on it. There was no guarantee that if you did it well for one project and you go to write something new, that it was going to be any good. It could be So anyway, I was working as a literary manager in Manhattan, and I was trying to write as much as possible. And so it's now about 4 years after my engagement ended, and I had tried dating and had different experiences and so forth. And then I reached a point where I was learning more and more about myself. And I'll admit that I was in therapy at the time, in psychoanalysis, so I had some experience with that. But I mention this because I remember saying, I've reached a point where I'm not going to keep doing the same things that I was doing before when it came to dating, because I thought I wanted to settle down at that point and find somebody. But sometimes I tried a little too hard, other times I didn't. But either way, I didn't feel like things were happening. And the New York City dating scene can be rather frustrating at times.
Yes.
But anyway, I just made a promise to myself. I said, I'm not going to keep worrying about it so much. I'm just going to let it go and go about my business. So I remember saying that to my therapist and kind of really feeling that in my heart of hearts. And then I walked out of there and I went to the subway, and I had a book on theater, a reference book on theater in my hand. And I was on a subway platform and I was looking at it. And this woman with an accent walks up to me and asks me about the book and strikes up a conversation with me.
Okay, which subway station were you in?
Street and Park Avenue. So it was
Which one again?
the Lexington line, the green line, what is it, 6 train
Yeah,
at 96 in Park, or we're really Lexington, but near Park Avenue.
gotcha.
So I literally went, around the corner and down into the subway. I was looking at the book, only thinking about the book, nothing, no other thought whatsoever, really. And then this woman strikes up a conversation with me. And now normally you think, I'm in a subway, everyone you got to watch out for, right? But she had an accent, and I loved the sound of her voice. And so she started telling me that she wanted to know more about theater in New York, and she introduced herself. So we got on the train, and she told me she's a children's author, and she showed me her book that she had at the time. And then she gave me her phone number, and we rode from the 96th Street subway down to
The last stop in Brooklyn.
yeah, right. Actually, it was the Grand Central Station, but it went yickety split, as they say. It was a real fast ride. At least that's how it felt. And we got out together. We talked for a little bit, and she was on her way to go teach a student in Portuguese. But I knew she was from Brazil, but I hate to admit this because I know all the Brazilians who know me are going to kill me afterwards. But I didn't have a clue about Brazil. I didn't even know they speak Portuguese in Brazil. So I was that oblivious at the time. And I thought, well, she's got a cute sounding voice. She looked pretty cute, and she wanted to know about theater. So I gave her a call. We went and saw a show together that following Friday, and the rest was history. But another momentous thing happened at that same time. We met the day after Valentine's Day. So it was February 15th, and that year was on a Monday. And again, I had reached that, there was someone I was interested in the night before that I had a get together with, and I concluded that wasn't going to happen. So I was fed up, and like I said, I was starting to make a change, and then I go down the subway, and there's my future wife. So anyway, 2 days after she and I met, her father died in Brazil. He and I won't go there right now, but the two of us wrote about him because he immigrated from Poland to Brazil in 1939. And that became a future project that my wife and I worked on.
And he was escaping, I believe, right? Because they're Jewish.
Yes. Her family grew up in a small Jewish community called Piatski, which is in the roughly by car, it's about 30 minutes southeast of Lublin. So it's in the southern.
We won't go into those details because you guys are going to hear all about that in Beti's interview next year.
So I don't want to steal her thunder by talking about it, but how he got to Brazil was purely by chance, by the way. I mean, there are no accidents, but it could have very easily not happened, is my point. So I met my wife in a way that it could have very easily not met. And I mentioned that her father passed away, but she didn't know, because we met on a Monday. We got together that following Friday. He passed away 2 days after we had met, but she didn't find out until after our first date together. And after our first date, we could tell that things were there was a spark there. And then, I found out from her that she, had lost her father, which did not prevent her from, still, for the two of us still getting together. But I never met him as a result. And we've wondered about that sometimes as to the coincidence of that. But anyway, because I met my wife, Beti, who's from Brazil, that eventually led me to Spiritism, because we met in 1993 and we were married a little over a year later, stayed in New York. Then we moved to New Jersey, where we are now. And I had not really, by the time I moved to New Jersey, I wasn't terribly aware of Spiritism per se, but Beti, being Jewish from Brazil, and as you well know, a lot of Brazilians are very comfortable mixing different religious
Right.
backgrounds, which to Americans I think is often considered odd, because we're used to compartmentalizing things like that. But in Brazil, it seems perfectly natural to mix, say, Christianity with Spiritism, and people don't think twice of it. Or if you're Jewish, to be at least take some interest in Christianity, or even become a Spiritist too, because Spiritism's open to, it doesn't really matter what your religious background is, because our relationship to the spirit world, it's either there or it isn't there.
Right.
And so I don't know exactly how she heard about this, but there were these workshops in Manhattan, which we started going to while we still lived in New York, because we got married. She moved into my apartment with me, and we were there for like a year and a half before we finally moved to New Jersey. Well, in the time that we got married and before, pretty much before we left Manhattan, we started taking a series of workshops with a fairly well-known Brazilian medium named Valdo Vieira.
He's very well known because he helped psychograph through automatic writing, I believe, 10 or 12 books that are masterpieces with Chico Xavier, with Chico Xavier. I think there are Sex and Destiny is one of them, which is already available in English. And he actually inspired, and because he was much younger than Chico, he sort of inspired him to have his first overseas trip to the United States and England. So he really had an important role. And he was doing workshops in Manhattan at the time.
Yes, what happened is that Valdo Vieira broke off from Spiritism. Don't know exactly why, but he just chose a different path. And he was very interested in what was called projectology, which was basically out-of-body experiences, astral projection. And I don't remember why we got involved in this, but my wife, well, I'll tell you this about my wife. She's the adventurous one. She loves to go out and do things, travel, and so forth. And I like to travel too, and we've done a lot of it together.
She said we did projectology, so you traveled in the body and outside the body.
Yes, yes. So, it's. I felt very fortunate to have met her, because I remember when I was in college thinking I do want to travel. And I remember talking to a professor of mine as I was getting out of school, and she said, by all means, travel, travel, travel. It's one of the best forms of education there is. And I was fortunate to meet someone who loves to travel and is very adventurous by nature. My wife is the outgoing one and I'm the hermit in many ways, or at least the shy one. Up to a point I am shy.
Peter, I got to tell you, you may seem like a hermit and introspective, but you've got so much more courage than many extroverts like myself. The ballroom dancing that is performed all over the place is some of the sweetest, most beautiful things we can watch. We can do that on another episode, because you guys have a lot of beautiful stuff together.
Yeah, the ballroom dancing we've been doing for about 5 years now. So it's something we jumped into late in life after talking about it for a while. And actually, before I met her, when I was a footloose and fancy-free bachelor in New York City, I did take some ballroom dancing lessons.
A very good skill if you're a single person, yes.
Yes, and that was part of the intent there. And I discovered I liked it. I always had a knack. I won't say I had a knack for it, but I had an interest in dancing going back even before. I remember enjoying that in college, even though I didn't know anything about ballroom dancing.
So take us back to the workshops of Valdo
Yeah.
Vieira. How does that then lead you guys to love and light or spiritism?
Well, what happened was this. The workshops were designed to teach people how to do astral projection. That was not something I was really adept at doing, and I didn't really connect with that. But what interested me, especially when I listened to Valdo Vieira talk, was the way he talked about the spirit world, because he's what they call in Spiritism an ostensive medium, meaning he could see spirits. And he could go out of his body very easily and go into different places in the spirit world. And he would describe what that was like a little bit. But the idea that we had an ongoing relationship between this world and the spirit world was intriguing me. And I was already interested in this stuff before that happened for a couple of reasons. A few years ago, I was looking at some of my journal writings from the mid 1980s when I was still living in Albany, trying to become a playwright. And I wrote how much reincarnation interested me. I didn't know anything about it, not really, but it interested me and it made sense to me. And I was struck a few years ago when I looked at these writings, which I had written a few decades before. Wow, okay. So I was interested in this stuff. And then I was working on a play very intensively after I got out of NYU and before I met Beti that definitely had spirits in it. I was very interested in this interaction between someone who was in this world, but he was talking to his grandfather. I won't go into that subject, but it's a project based upon a historic event that my grandfather was involved in. And the main character is talking to his grandfather who's no longer around. So on the one hand, he's kind of a projection, but at the same time, I saw him as a spirit, and he was real. And he wasn't the only one. There were there were some Japanese characters in this play, and I was very interested in the way the Japanese understand what it means to venerate one's ancestors. And in the case of the two Japanese characters who were spirits, they are what we would call wandering spirits in Spiritism, meaning they were spirits that were very attached to this earth. They were unhappy and upset, and they were troubled, and they didn't really know exactly where they were. And they were very attached to the land that used to belong to them. So they were spirits that had not really moved on to the spirit world. So I was writing all this stuff not having any knowledge whatsoever about Spiritism yet. So I was writing this stuff, and then I met my wife. After we got married, we got interested in Valdo Vieira's workshops. And the point I want to make about that was astral projection wasn't something that I really connected with too much. But the way Valdo Vieira talked about the spirit world, I concluded that a lot of what was happening in these projectology workshops was very much similar to Spiritism. It's just that he had his own language for everything. But the concepts were there. You know, he literally had his own language for a lot of this stuff. But even now, if I look back on it, I can see there were a lot of similarities. So this subject was beginning to interest me. And then my wife and I started collaborating on children's stories together, which was something I wasn't doing before I met her. And we would write about spirits sometimes and kind of touch on this stuff a little bit. Again, I didn't know much about Spiritism. And before I left New York, I was also collaborating on a play with an actress that was about spirituality. It was about a woman who was kind of trying to find herself. And so she goes through like a new age phase, and she does these workshops on being a new age type. And, the way I saw it was we were making fun of the oh so preciousness of this. But part of what was happening in that play was this woman was going through a series of different phases. She went through a new age phase and a kind of anger, stop the insanity type phase, and then more of a corporate phase after that. And the project didn't work too well, but it got me thinking more about spirituality. And I also felt I need to know more about this in some way. And so we moved to New Jersey. This is 1996 at this point. And we settled. We moved because we thought we were going to have at least one child, and we did. And around the time that our son was born, which was in the late 90s, Spiritist group Love and Light, where I'm now the president, was in Fairview, New Jersey. That's where it began. And it was started, one of the founders of it was a woman named Regina, who Beti knew. And I think it was through their acquaintance and that Beti found out about this. And she was interested in this stuff because in Brazil, she didn't do Spiritism per se, but she was interested in Umbanda and things like that. So
she had an affinity for it.
She had an affinity for it, exactly. So we started going. At that time, there was nothing in English, so I wasn't able to participate too much. But eventually, Love and Light transferred or went to Newark, so we had a longer drive. And around that same time, I think it was, at its first location, there started studies were available in English. And so I began to study. And I studied with a woman named Elza DeGasto, and Mara Brandau was the president at that time. And so I studied with Elza for many, many years. And not too long after, I think not too long after Love and Light had moved to Newark, I had another kind of big life-changing event besides my son being born, which was that my grandmother, who was 99, passed away. And then a year later, my father passed away. And then 2 years after that, my mother passed away.
Oh, wow.
Both my mother and my father, who had, I saw both of them. They were both, my mother at that point was in Colorado. My father had moved out of California a year after I did to Washington State, got remarried. But I kept in touch with him, of course, and with my mother. And they both passed. She was 77 and he was 79 or so. And so that was a big event. And at that point, I was involved enough with Spiritism that it really helped me a lot to kind of begin
to comfort.
process.
Yeah, it's interesting the timings of things. You met Beti the week her father passes away, so you are a source of comfort for her.
Yeah.
And you meet Spiritism and begin to study it in depth right before both of your parents pass away.
Yeah, and then my involvement at Love and Light stepped up after my mother passed away. I remember that pretty clearly. I'm a little fuzzy, to be honest with you, about some of the study period before, but when we've now are in our third location in Newark, and at the second location, I was definitely getting more involved at that point, and my mother had passed away. And again, I got through that period. I have to thank Spiritism for that in many ways, because it helped me to think about what it means to, to cross over and not to feel so threatened by it. And it's something that, of course, people in the United States often feel uncomfortable with, to say the least. It was hardly the first experience I'd had with death. First experience there was, I was 7, and there was a classmate of mine who was killed in a construction accident near our school. And I remember that had a big effect on me, just as losing my grandfather at the age of 14 also had a big effect on me. And then my aunt a year later was killed in a car accident. So I'd had these experiences. And then I mentioned another person, during work in Santa Fe, New Mexico, who was killed. So,
and I got to say something about Spiritist group Love and Light.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of the most beautiful communities I've experienced in the Spiritist centers around the region here. The services, the activities, the events, the fundraisers, the parties, the gatherings, there's just love and light abounds in everybody's hearts, the generosity, the friendship, the camaraderie. And it really is a Spiritist community center because it is part of the surrounding community, helps the community through charitable works, and actually leads me to the next topic of Peter, which involves not just teaching and studying in the center, but sharing his music and teaching music to groups inside the center, and then taking that out to the nursing homes and the hospitals through the volunteer work that he does. So, and I think that's where you and I connected first. And I think it's unfortunate right now that we have a pandemic and we can't visit them in person, but on the other hand, has led us to do some pretty creative outreach efforts to maintain the connection with the patients we visit and serve, as well as with the group itself. I'm involved in different Caravan of Love groups, and we connect every other week to just have a gospel moment or read something uplifting and share about our friendship, to keep this flame alive, to keep this going until we can start having the visits again.
Right.
And I want to share a little video now to our audience, which is part of this outreach effort with creativity and technology that the folks at Love and Light and with Peter's guidance put together to play for the patients, the staff, and the families of the place that they visit on a regular basis, called Alaris Health Nursing Home in Newark, New Jersey? No.
West Orange.
West Orange, New Jersey. Take a look. You might recognize some faces here, friends. It's really cute. Here we go. Just want to make sure the audio is also going to play. Give me a second.
Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be. But when the night is cloudy, there is still a light that shines on me. Shine until tomorrow, let it be. I wake up to the sound of music. Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be.
Super cute. And Dory is present, right,
Dory is
Thiago?
present, absolutely. And she barks on cue at one point in that video.
I love it because she's a musician's dog. She knows how to play in rhythm and tempo. And this is actually,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, please.
This was the first time we'd done anything like this, a video like this. And so it was an experiment for us. But it was the intent of it was to send a little tribute to the patients at the Alaris Nursing Home in West Orange.
And you have also video testimonials of people giving individual messages later in the video to them, because we really develop friendships with these patients. We know their names, we know their loved ones. When they pass away, we put their names in the book of prayers, and we've experienced many times their spirits visiting our mediumistic meetings in beautiful testimonials of gratitude, which really just overflows our heart with joy. And this is a really quick video of a Chris visit that we had together there that I'm going to play. You guys get a feel for it, how it's everybody having a good time, and the patients, even though they can't move around so much because a lot of them are very debilitated, they're receiving something quite cool. Right in time for the holidays. Holiday cheer. So I want to ask you this, Peter. First, I want to commend you for something that I've told you before. The courage it takes somebody like you, a native English speaker, to accept the challenge of being a leader, the president of one of the largest and oldest Spiritist community centers in America is incredible. And I wish you all the protection, the inspiration, the energy, the everything, and the resources, which undoubtedly the Spirit Friends are helping you to set the example for other native English speakers like yourself to rise up to the challenge and be able to steward the movement forward. And in a way, give it into the hands of this country's people, since we all have been striving so much to do this work in English, which for 90% of us is not our mother tongue. And culturally, there are so many differences between Brazilians and Americans that inevitably we end up tuning out some Americans by being too Brazilian around them without meaning any harm by it, right?
Sure.
And so to be able to have somebody at the helm like you to help bridge the cultural divide that sometimes can occur, I think it's very wise on the part of Love and Light as a group, as well as very commendable for yourself to take that challenge, which we all know is extremely difficult. So congratulations on this. And I want to lead on asking you, if you had no limitations of resources, of time, of money, of people, of talents, how would you envision the Spiritist Community Center as a whole? How would you envision this in the future here in this country?
Well, before I answer that question, I just want to say I feel incredibly blessed to have such an amazing and very dedicated, large team of people at Love and Light. There are several individuals, counselors, coordinators, workers who have been there for a long time. They have a lot of knowledge, and they have a lot of commitment. They have a variety of talents, and there's absolutely no way any of this would work without them. You know, when I thought about trying to take this on, I thought a lot about that a lot, that if it weren't for the amazing people there, and I hope they know who they all are, because there are several of them, I could not imagine trying to take this one on. But I felt very comfortable at Love and Light from, really the time I first started. And I connected with it. I liked the atmosphere there. And as you said, it's one of the oldest centers in the country. Next year will be our 30th. So it's Love and Light is, for me, is a lot of things. One of which is that it tries to be open to people who speak different languages. So predominantly Portuguese, but also English and Spanish. And so the trilingual environment to me is very important, as well as the commitment that the people there have to really studying Spiritism and trying to engage. By the way, one of the things about Spiritism I always really connected with was the study groups and the ability to just speak freely and explore different ideas and debate topics and so forth. And it requires, I think, an open mind, and we all have to be humble enough to realize that we don't have all the answers by any means. And if you go to a place where people think they do have all the answers, that's probably not the place for me. But when I think about what would love and light be like if we could do anything, we had unlimited resources, as it were, the thing.
Mm-hmm. Or the Spiritist Community Center in general, up to you. Doesn't have to be specifically love and light. Could be in general.
Well, I would like to be able to have us do more programming in all three languages. I would like to see more people who are English speakers be involved, but absolutely want one of the important aspects of Love and Light is that it, like many Spiritist centers, is very, very much a reflection of the community it's in. In Newark, New Jersey, we have a lot of people who've come over from Brazil or other countries, and they need to be in an environment where they're comfortable. So they need to be able to speak their native tongue and not feel like they can't for any reason. And so I want that to be able to happen. But if there's a way that we could have more interaction and integration among the different languages, that would be ideal. I would love if we had our own space that we owned at some point, that we had the facilities that were large enough to have, rooms for study, rooms for the lectures, and so forth. I would love to see us be more involved than we already are in participating in the community and
Right.
people. We are right now we're helping a community in Brazil in the area of Valencia in Bahia. It's a small town, a small village really, of people who are in a very difficult place and very impoverished, and we've been supporting them for years because our former president, her sister, has been involved in helping them. And so we've been doing fundraisers over the years and have had this program that's been around for quite some time now. And we're trying to help them by reaching out to the children and helping the children to learn that there are other possibilities in their lives, that they have more options than they might think they do, that it is possible to get an education. It's possible to start maybe branching outside of this community. It's also an area that's got a lot of social problems and so forth. And so my thought about doing more outreach in Newark would be to partner with some of the existing organizations more.
Right.
I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel and kind of
Right.
do our own per se. There's one organization called Montana Ajuda, and at least two of our members are active there right now, especially during the pandemic. And I commend
Right.
a great deal for their courage and their commitment. I think we want to be able to have a self-sufficient sources of income. We do fundraising through holiday parties, through contributions, regular contributions from people, and we have our bookstore. We sell books, and a bazaar that sells used items and so forth. So those are all the traditional sources of funding. If we could get perhaps outside funding, that would be just as another source of raising funds.
For sure.
But I very much think it's important that the people at the center be actively involved in raising income for the center too.
Yeah. It's always a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. And I think there's something to be said about owning our own space gives you a little more financial independence and stability to really then focus on the activities, the programs, the events, including the community outreach with a little more peace of mind than constantly having to worry about the rent. Well, you may have to pay the mortgage, of course, but at least long term, it gives that center firmer and stronger roots to the community they're in. And a sense of belonging on many levels so that they can truly open their doors to the community in the community's needs, which are not just spiritual, but also material.
Right. So ideally, we would have a team of people who have the time and the dedication to be able to really get more involved with the community. We have a lot of people in our center who are very committed, but they're also spread pretty thin, and they're very busy, and they've got a lot happening outside of the center. So, you have to work with those realities as well. I think it would be, in terms of our expenses and so forth, the vast majority of it goes to rent, And so in a perfect situation, we would own our own space free and clear, no mortgage whatsoever. Then we really could focus more on trying to raise money and perhaps doing some kind of program that is similar to what we're doing in Brazil, but here.
For the community. We had a brainstorming session at Inner Enlightenment Spirit Society a couple of years ago where we asked this question, this blue sky question. And one of the people there had a great idea that he wanted to have some of these RVs that would have shower facilities, doctors would intake patients, get their addresses, help them with documentation, connect them with food pantries, and provide them with support. And these would be stationed RVs that would move around in different neighborhoods of Manhattan, and supported by the Spiritist Center. And I thought that was such a brilliant, they could, shower, do their hygiene there. I mean, it was like an all-inclusive solution in stationed RVs. And I thought that was amazing. And it is possible to do. We just need the funds and the volunteers, the people of goodwill, which we have so many of in this Spiritist community. Peter, last words for our chat tonight regarding next year or the holiday season. Anything you'd like to share with the people that are watching, or with the Love and Light community here?
I think it's important that all of us everywhere, but certainly at Love and Light too, that we remember one of the most important lessons of Spiritism, which is not giving up and maintaining one's faith and taking the long-term view of things. By its nature, Spiritism really encourages us to think long-term. This is a time when people are getting discouraged. They're tired of not being able to lead their lives the way they were before. Our center's physical space is still closed, but we never closed. We just moved everything online, and we're doing that. And I realize there are some people who really want to go back to this physical space. And we will, but not as quickly as people would like, especially now because we've got a resurgence. But I ask that people remember, we will get through this. This too shall pass. It's not going to end as quickly as anybody wants, but it doesn't mean it won't end. Everything we go through doesn't last forever. This is one of the main things. Well, there are lots of things that Spiritism teaches us, but that's a big one. It's important that we not get discouraged by the day-to-day, even when we have bad days. Today was maybe a difficult day. That doesn't mean it's going to be difficult tomorrow, the next day, or maybe the next few days are difficult, but whatever it is, it's still, everything we're going through now, we will get through it. And so we just have to be able to really hang in there. And this is what it means to have faith. Also, I think it's important that one is a Spiritist everywhere, not just in a Spiritist center. We are Spiritist 24/7. So we have to put everything we study into practice, which means we do it in our families, our places of work, wherever we go in the world, wherever we're out and about, we have to have this within our hearts. And so the more we can do that, then the more I think all of us can learn to just be more at peace with the situation that we're facing, which, like I said, it's not going to last forever, but it is a trial, a big one on a variety of levels, which obviously I don't have time to get into, even if I had all the answers. But it's, it's very, very important that we both take things one day at a time, to use an AA term, but at the same time be confident that things are not going to be the same in the future, but that doesn't mean life as we know it is over, or anything melodramatic like that.
Right. Beautiful, Peters. Spoken like someone who walks the talk.
I tried.
So I wanted to close our conversation around the fire tonight with music, of course, and invite everyone to stay tuned for our next episode, which will be on Wednesday of next week. We're going to invite Emmanuel Dutra, who is at the forefront of translating Kardec's books into Chinese. Has already published the Spirit's book, the Gospel, and I believe the Medium's book is in the midst of being finalized and being published, and in the largest language that's spoken in the world today. So we're going to bring him next week. He's going to share what has been some of the challenges and exciting experiences around that. And so please stay tuned next Wednesday at 7 p.m. And want to wish you, Beti, everyone at Love and Light, your son, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and stay connected in this unity of the community. And closing here with a song from the group, The Fifth Dimension, called The Age of Aquarius, where they say, let the sun shine in, let the sun shine in.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.